In this video, I will go over the transformational theory of leadership. This theory has also been around for a while, since the 70s. And it is the most researched theory in the area of leadership. It's a very popular theory, as you can imagine. But the most important thing is that it has a lot of empirical support in its favor. So even though it has been researched a lot, it also has a lot of support in its favor. So because of some of these reasons, this is one of my favorite theories of leadership as well. So that's what we will go over. But before I start explaining what transformational theory of leadership is, I must contrast it with two other theories. One is the transactional leadership theory, and the second one is charismatic leadership theory. Because transformational leadership theory takes some of the best points from both these leadership theories. It also addresses some of the weaknesses that are there in these theories. So in order to understand and appreciate the transformational theory of leadership well, it will be good if we understand what transactional leadership theory is and what charismatic leadership theory is. So the transactional leadership theory that is built on the foundation of operant conditioning. And I will go over transactional leadership theory in detail in the next slide. Charismatic leadership theory has its foundation in the trait theories or personality theories. So different leaders will have different personality traits. Some of those personality traits are considered charismatic in nature, which then give the leader a lot of power, referent power specifically. So transformational leadership addresses the weaknesses of both these theories as well as builds on the strengths of these theories, and consequently ends up being a very powerful leadership theory. Now, since the transactional leadership theory is built on the foundation of operant conditioning and reinforcement theory, it will be helpful if we understand what those theories tell us. Again, I won't go into the depth of these theories because it is assumed that you understand. I will just touch upon the basics of these theories. So, operant conditioning. What does operant conditioning tell us? It tells us that any behavior, when followed by a pleasant consequence, will increase the likelihood that behavior is going to be repeated. Specifically, it is called the behavior is being reinforced or strengthened. Any behavior when followed by an unpleasant consequence, for example, a punishment, will lead to the likelihood of that behavior getting not repeated. Okay, so that's the basic premise. Any behavior followed by reward would make us want us to repeat that behavior. Any behavior followed by a punishment or any unpleasant consequence. Because there are types of rewards and types of punishments that will then lead us to not want to repeat those behaviors. That is the basic premise. And there are much more complexities to operant conditioning. There are many types of reinforcement, which I was just suggesting. There are many schedules of reinforcement. Now, when do you reward? How do you reward? One can spend a lot of time going into those complexities. We won't here. Instead, we will straight away jump into transactional leadership theory, which, as you can see, was discussed in the 70s by Burns. So why do we call it a transaction? Because the follower or the followers, they perform certain tasks for the leader, and the leader in turn rewards the followers for a job well done. So that is the transaction that is happening between the leader and the followers. The followers do the work for the leader rewards them or punishes them if they don't do the job well. So that is the transaction happening. That is the reason it is called transactional leadership. And this is the most common way of leading. It is anytime you ask anybody how you want to motivate somebody, people will typically think in terms of incentives. So what rewards can we give people so that they will be getting motivated? So this is the most common way that people approach motivation. Now let's go through some of the specific behaviors that are associated with transactional leadership behavior. The first one is called contingent reward. And this is the most important subtype of transactional leadership. What does it mean? Straightforward. The leader rewards the follower for the follower's good performance. In other words, the reward is contingent upon the follower's performance. If the follower does not perform well, the leader will not reward the follower. So it is contingent performance. If we are talking about our regular monthly salary, which if it is not contingent upon our performance, then that is not contingent reward. Just getting our regular base salary will not be considered contingent reward then. Only when the rewards are made contingent upon performance, that is when we call it contingent reward. And that could be like you achieving the sales targets and then I reward you with a promotion. That would be contingent reward. Or I give you a raise or I give you a bonus. Then that's an example of contingent reward. But it need not be restricted to such situations. Even in classroom situations, you turn in good quality work, you get a good grade. That is contingent reward. Even in politics, you vote for me, I pass the legislation that reduces taxes. That is again contingent reward. There's an exchange happening here. Uh, the next subcategory of transactional leadership is called management by exception. The easiest way to think about it is it's the punishment side of transactions. So when we are using the term exception here, we are not describing positive exceptions, exceptions in terms of excellent performance. No, rather we are describing negative exceptions where you didn't meet the performance standards. So how do you respond then? There are two subtypes of management by exception. One is active management by exception, and the second one is passive management by exception. The active management by exception is that the leader is constantly monitoring the followers' work, constantly looking for any mistakes that the follower makes and any violations that the follower makes and corrects the follower. You should not be doing this, that's wrong, and corrects the follower. That is active management by exception. Then there is something called passive management by exception. And that is that the leader lets the follower do his stuff, doesn't interfere, doesn't constantly monitor the follower. But anytime the follower makes a major violation, any major problem, then the leader intervenes and corrects the follower or reprimands the follower. That is passive management by exception. So these are the two broad categories, or three if we divide active and passive management by exception, three different types of transactional leadership. Now, which one do you think is most effective? Which one do you think is the least effective? This graph explains how the three transactional leadership behaviors that we just explained fare on their effectiveness. When we talk about effectiveness of leadership, it is always on those two main standards, which is achievement of goals and then satisfaction of the employees, right? There can be other standards as well, but those are the two main standards that we use to evaluate the effectiveness of leadership. So contingent reward turns out to be the most effective. It is a more active form of leading, and it is also more effective form of leading. Management by exception, the active version, also turns out to be more effective than management by exception passive. This may seem a little counterintuitive because management by exception, the active version may seem like micromanagement. People don't like being micromanaged. Yet it turns out to be more effective than the passive form because at least those monitoring, close monitoring and giving them that negative feedback helps the employees, helps the followers correct their path. Whereas if you do not give them any negative feedback, you wait until the end, you wait until it's too late for the employees or for the subordinates to fix the issue and then reprimand them or then give them negative feedback. That can be very demotivating. That is the reason management by exception passive is the least effective of the three transactional leadership behaviors that we talked about. The last one that you see here is the laissez-faire leadership. It is not exactly even leadership. You essentially are completely passive. You let the followers do their own stuff, you are not leading. So that is, of course, then the least effective. So the summary is that contingent rewards can be very effective. And there is evidence of contingent reward being an effective way of leading. Management by exception is generally not as effective, and especially not effective if you are using it exclusively. The best way to think about it is management by exception will work only if you are also engaging in contingent reward, if you are appreciating people for their job well done, and then when you correct them for their mistakes, then they will be much more open to fixing those mistakes. If you aren't engaging in contingent reward, in other words, if you don't appreciate the job that they do well and only focus on their mistakes, then obviously they will not be receptive. Irrespective of whether you are doing management by exception active or passive, they will not be receptive towards it, and that will actually lead them to be demotivated, and the productivity can go down. So that's what we need to keep in mind when we are talking about usage of management by exception. We are not saying that you should not use it, because there are certain times where management by exception is important, it's necessary. When somebody is not performing well, when somebody commits any ethical misconduct, for instance, you have to intervene and engage in some coercive power and fix those issues. You have to take certain corrective actions there. Yet, if you are only doing that, if you are, then you will not be effective. So make sure that you engage in contingent reward much more to balance out any of the negative interactions that you have to do as a leader. So we saw that the transactional approach to leadership can be very effective, especially the contingent reward approach. But for that matter, even management by exception, if it is combined with contingent reward. So it's a beneficial approach. But despite these benefits, it also has some major weaknesses. The first major weakness of the theory comes from the fact that it relies so heavily on rewards and punishments. In other words, it is all about extrinsic motivation. It tries to enhance the extrinsic motivation of the employees, of the followers, which means that people will be motivated to do that work as long as they are getting those rewards. But if you stop those rewards, or if you cannot pay them those rewards, then potentially they may stop performing to the standards that you are expecting them to perform. So that's one weakness. The second weakness, the flip side of it, is that it doesn't help with intrinsic motivation, because that's ultimately what we want. We want our followers to be intrinsically motivated. They wanting to do that job, and they wanting to do that job well, not just because they are getting some reward for doing the job well. But even worse is that there is research, quite a substantial body of research, that shows evidence that in certain conditions, heavy reliance on these rewards can even reduce intrinsic motivation. So that is problematic. At least if we are not being able to enhance intrinsic motivation, we should be able to we should not be reducing the intrinsic motivation, but that is a possibility that can happen. Doesn't happen always, but it can happen in certain conditions. Another major problem of the transactional approach is that research suggests it works with certain kind of tasks better. So there is again a substantial body of research showing that rewards tend to be very effective for certain kinds of tasks. Tasks that are simple, easy, straightforward, routine, and almost like menial kind of tasks. For those kind of tasks, rewards tend to be very effective. But when it comes to jobs or tasks that are complex, that involve analytical thinking, that involves critical thinking, creative problem solving, the efficacy of rewards is questionable. So that's again another major weakness, especially with the economy going in that direction where there are more jobs in the knowledge economy. That can be a problem. Another problem is that incentives or rewards can sometimes end up motivating the wrong behavior. Now, you are rewarding a person because you are thinking that with that reward, the person will be motivated to work harder, right? You may set goals for your employee, and you may tell him that if you achieve that particular goal, then you will be rewarding the person with a bonus or a promotion or whatever. But uh, it may actually encourage unethical behavior. You are not expecting that. You are rewarding the person in the hope that he would be working harder or smarter, but not necessarily in an unethical way to achieve the same performance target. So rewards can potentially, in certain conditions, encourage the wrong behavior. That is another major problem with reliance only on these rewards and punishments. If I summarize these points, actually it's a distinct point as well. Contingent reward and management by exception combined do help with respect to achieving expected outcomes. But if we want our employees to perform beyond expectations, which will typically be associated with intrinsic motivation, that typically is not accomplished only through transactional leadership. This part of the equation, transactional leadership to achievement of expected outcomes, is fairly strong, but uh, we may want our followers to go beyond achievement of those expected outcomes. We want them to put their heart and soul into the job. That may not be possible. That is unlikely to be possible through reliance on the transactional model of leadership. This then brings us to the other leadership theory, which is the charismatic leadership theory. Because charismatic leaders often are excellent when it comes to inspiring people to reach extraordinary heights, right? They can inspire people to put their heart and soul into jobs. And so the weaknesses of the transactional leadership can be fixed partly by charismatic leadership, though charismatic leadership also has its own sets of weaknesses, which we will come to in a bit. So then, what is charisma? It's a Greek word which means it's a divinely inspired gift. It's a divine gift, meaning everyone doesn't get it. Only few people, the few lucky ones, have that gift, that charisma. So, what is that gift? That gift is certain combination of traits that make you a very magnetic kind of personality, that gives you a lot of charm, so people see you as a hero, people look up to you. So there are certain combination of traits that is not very common. It is only very few people who are lucky to have that combination of traits then who become charismatic leaders. That is the traditional thinking about charismatic leadership. The charismatic leaders, they tend to have a lot of self-confidence. They exude confidence. People, because of that reason, like to follow them. They are very good with their communication skills as well. They use a lot of stories, anecdotes. They make that connection, that emotional connection with you when they are talking to you. So it is not just the verbal aspect of the communication, but also the non-verbal aspect of the communication that is very powerful, that helps them connect with people at an emotional, at an intimate level. Related to the same communication level is vision. They, instead of just giving people goals to accomplish, they express it in a way that is very inspiring, that people can literally see those goals getting fructified, which then inspires them to work towards achievement of those goals. So they are very expressive in their language. They make an emotional connection with people, which I just mentioned also in context of communication. So these are some of the distinctive aspects of charismatic leaders. If we describe charismatic leaders in context of the sources of power, French and Raven model, they tend to have high referent power and maybe also certain amount of expert power, but definitely a lot of referent power. And we know that referent power is the most effective amongst the sources of power. So that's what charismatic leaders have. So does charismatic leadership work? Yes, it does. People tend to trust such leaders very easily. In fact, they start holding beliefs similar to that of the leader. If the leader is charismatic, they tend to like such leaders more. So they have a lot of affection for such leaders. They like to emulate or they try to be like that leader. They engage in a lot of extra role commitment, which is what I had mentioned before. They have a lot of involvement. They're much more committed to goals, but they go even beyond goals and engage in extra role commitment. So the extra step that we want our employees to engage in, we may see that if the leader is charismatic. There is another major weakness of the charismatic leadership, at least the traditional way of thinking about charismatic leadership, though it is not completely true now. And that is that it's heavily rooted in the trait approach. Only some people have that right combination of traits that make them these charismatic individuals. Uh, that then doesn't give much hope for people like you and me who may not have that much of charisma. So it is something that we can feel good about if we have that ability, but if we do not, then it doesn't give us any way to improve our charisma. Though, as I said, more of the recent research on charismatic leadership does talk about how one can improve upon one's charisma. But I will not go into that much of detail here because partly that is covered also in the transformational leadership theory. This then brings us to the transformational leadership theory, which builds on the strengths and weaknesses of transactional leadership theory and the charismatic leadership theory. The transformational leadership theory focuses on four different behaviors, and they all start with I: idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and idealized consideration. So, we had discussed before that transactional leadership only leads to expected outcomes, but not people going beyond performance expectations. That can be achieved through charismatic leadership, but then that has a lot of weaknesses. Plus, if you do not have that charisma, you cannot do much about it. But transformational leadership theory, it is a behavioral leadership theory. It is not talking about the kind of traits that transformational leaders have. Rather, it is talking about what specific behaviors should leaders engage in if they want people to be inspired to work towards achievement of goals that go beyond the minimum expected outcomes. Okay, and these are those four behaviors. So if we compare it with transactional leadership, which was again a behavioral approach, it told us what to do. You reward, you reprimand. So transformational leadership is also a behavioral approach. It is not a trait approach. But while being a behavioral approach, it is helping us move from just expected outcomes to even beyond expected outcomes. Another key difference between transactional and transformational leadership, even though they are both behavioral, is that in transactional leadership, the focus is more on day-to-day activities and then rewarding them for those performance. When it comes to transformational leadership, though, it is focusing on changing the person, changing even the intrinsic motivational levels of the person. So it's about bringing about major change in a person, and you achieve that by making an emotional connection with the person. So there is a lot of emotional bond between a transformational leader and the followers. So what can you do to be a transformational leader? There are four I's 4 behaviors that start with I's that you need to engage in. The first one is called idealized influence. I would say that this is the most important as well. Idealized influence is being a strong role model. Idealized influence, so being the ideal role model. You influence people by being that ideal that they aspire to be. So this is like walking the talk. So you are not just preaching big things, but you are practicing what you preach. You practice even more than what you preach. Okay? You set extremely high standards for yourself, moral standards, ethical standards. If you want your employees to work hard, you work even harder. You put even more number of hours. It's like leading from the front. A general who is leading from the front as opposed to giving the soldiers the orders to march towards the enemy. So this is called idealized influence, because then people feel inspired to follow you. When they see such high standards in a person, they feel inspired to follow you. So whatever vision that you may be having, they will be much more committed to you, committed to realizing that vision, because they believe in you, they respect you. That is the reason they will be willing to go to any lengths while they are following you. So that is idealized influence. The second is inspirational motivation. This is the part that is most strongly related to the charismatic leadership theory that we have already discussed. It's all about communication, communicating high expectations, communicating through appropriate usage of language, appropriate usage of non-verbal language, and that helps make that connection with people. So this is the part that actually overlaps with the charismatic theory of leadership, which I discussed, the traditional part of charismatic leadership. The key difference here is that here we are focusing on the behaviors as opposed to traits. So that is inspirational motivation. The third one is called intellectual stimulation. And this is about stimulating the followers to think creatively, to think innovatively. So they are not expected to just follow your directions. Instead, you are giving them the opportunity, the space to come up with new innovative ideas. You welcome such ideas, such new ways of doing things. That's what then gets them excited. So you support them in this process instead of being close-minded to their suggestions, to their ideas about how they could implement things. You actually encourage it. So that is intellectual stimulation. And finally, we have individualized consideration. This is similar to the LMX theory that we have discussed before. It is about caring for each individual. So it is supportive behavior, but not in a generic sense. Rather, supportive behavior individualized to different people in your team or different followers. So you are being considerate, but in an individualized manner. So you listen carefully to followers, you try to understand their individual needs, you care for them, you show confidence in them, you even may challenge them because you are committed to their growth and development. So this is individualized consideration. You give them opportunities. It's very similar to LMX theory. So these are the 4 sets of behaviors that is recommended that you engage in if you want to enhance the intrinsic motivation of your followers, if you want them to perform beyond expectations, which cannot be accomplished only through the usage of rewards and punishments. Now let's quickly go over the key differences between transformational leadership theory and charismatic leadership theory. One, of course, is that transformational leadership focuses on behaviors, whereas charismatic leadership, at least the traditional form, focused on traits, whether or not you have those charismatic traits. But beyond that, another major difference comes from the fact that transformational leaders, they tend to focus on the followers. In transformational leadership, we have 2 components that highlights this. One is intellectual stimulation, where the leader encourages the followers to think independently, to think creatively. So that is then giving followers the freedom to think independently. Uh, Even individualized consideration, really caring for people, um, and also their individual needs. This emphasis that there is towards people uh, makes it much more unique than the charismatic leadership theory, which is all about having the right personality combination so that you are perceived by others to be a very charismatic, magnetic kind of person. So that's the key difference. There can be transformational leaders who are perceived to be charismatic, and it's not unusual. If you engage in all these four leadership behaviors, you can easily be perceived to be a charismatic individual. But not all charismatic leaders engage in all these four transformational leadership behaviors. Most charismatic leaders may just engage in what is called inspirational motivation, but not enough of intellectual stimulation or idealized influence, for instance. So we have seen this graph before, except that we have a new box now, which is referring to the four I's from the transformational leadership theory, and we can see that that is the most effective way of leading. So it is even more effective than the transactional model of leadership. This does not mean that you should not engage in transactional model of leadership. Rewards and punishments are important, as I have mentioned several times before. But when it comes to overall efficacy, transformational leaders tend to be much more effective than people who are only engaging in the transactional style of leadership. Now let's talk about something called the pseudo transformational leaders. These are leaders who appear to be transformational leaders but actually aren't transformational leaders. Such leaders are actually bad for the organization. They're bad for the people. So how do we distinguish between a real transformational leader and a false one? The key thing to remember is that transformational leaders engage in all those four I's, but pseudo transformational leaders, most of the time, they engage only in inspirational motivation. So they focus a lot on that communication, how they appear to others, but they do not engage in the other four I's. They tend to be rather self-serving. So instead of being a best possible role model, having high ethical, moral standards, they have they're low ethical standards. They're focused more on their own personal benefits rather than really caring for their followers. And how do we know whether or not the leader cares for the followers? Do the leaders encourage independent thinking in you, which is nothing but intellectual stimulation? Do they care for you? Do they care for you at an individual level, which is individualized consideration? So if the leader is only engaging in inspirational motivation, okay, and not in enough of idealized influence, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration, then most likely this person is a pseudo transformational leader. And you should be wary of such leaders because they can harm you. So engaging in those four I's can be an extremely effective way of leading. Transformational leadership is great. That does not mean that it is without any criticisms. Some of the criticisms that have been laid against the theory is that there is overlap between some of those dimensions. So there is some conceptual clarity that needs to be there. For example, if I am caring for you individually, that is individualized consideration, but that could overlap with my communication with you, which is inspirational motivation, right? So there can be a little bit of overlap across some of those dimensions. Uh, some measurement issues, at least with some of those questionnaires that have been used to measure transformational leadership, like the MLQ. But anyway, most of these weaknesses have been addressed over the decades of research that has gone into this. Overall, this is a great theory. There are more strengths in this approach than there are weaknesses. So this is a theory that I will strongly suggest that you try to incorporate in your lives if you want to be a very effective leader and effective change agent.